Oceania Part II. So here we go, globalization and development, just like usual. Let's talk about some extractive resources, some mining, sort of a big deal here. So Nauru, island nation in the South Pacific, was once a vibrant economy in the 1970s, and for a moment in the 1970s, one of the wealthiest economies per capita, but just for a shining moment. Didn't last. But they were known for producing fertilizer through high-grade phosphates and through eons of bird droppings, actually, guano, that was in the region. And so that has tapered off as an industry, but nevertheless very successful for some time in harnessing that resource. Nevertheless, the region as a whole, parts of Australia, New Zealand, and other South Pacific islands, but not so much those, very important for extractive resources. We're going to talk about shifting economies. So largely the exportation of coal and other minerals and resources. Australia and others shifting away from that and moving more towards a service-based sort of service or knowledge-based economy at this point, but for a long while this was the predominant economy, extractive resources, and the major economic form for largely Australia. So interest from Asia, just a few years back, China and India bought the exports from mines that were happening in Australia, so there is interest from China in the region as a whole for development purposes, and you know, it's a nearby area that has for sure a ton of different resources, some that aren't you know, readily available in China and Chinese mainland. So there's interest from China for globalization and development, interest from Asia as a whole, especially those more successful economies. Shifting economy, like I mentioned, that's taking place largely in Australia and others. This idea of a MIRAB, whatever we want to pronounce this, but just an acronym, so you pronounce it how you like, economy. And this is the type of economy based on migration, so moving around, both internal and external. Remittances, if you remember this all the way back, I think we talked about it with the example of Mexico, but it occurs certainly in different places where somebody will work either somewhere else in or out of the country, but they'll send large amounts of their salaries and their savings back to somewhere else in a big part of the economy, and aid-supported bureaucracy. And this is largely the type of economies of those smaller, less economically vibrant countries, like some of the island states. And so their economy is largely based on here. They're relatively successful in terms of subsistence living. They're, you know, getting by, but this idea for growth and really advancing the economy through this type of economy is certainly not there. So there's really no great potential in this type of economy, but as a way of life for getting by, it's doing pretty well. However, tourism increasing more and more in the region, so it's a growing part of the economy. Approximately 18 million visitors annually, mostly from Asia, pretty close. Quite a few from North America and Europe, but largely from Asia. Some from even within the region itself, just hopping among islands, you know, for tourist purposes. However, you know, it's not the cleanest of industries. It's probably cleaner, obviously, than some. But the book talks about the costs of the industry causing negative ecological impacts in the region. The idea of runoff from golf courses when you treat the lawn, the greens and the fairways and things with these chemicals. Some runoff involved into the waterways, beach erosion, and the idea of humans, you know, going diving and snorkeling and really messing with some natural reefs and corals and things. So there are negative ecological impacts for sure in huge booms of tourists, but it's a big industry, increasingly so. 18 million people annually visit the region. So power and politics, and we got two ideas of the Pacific influence, the Pacific Way. It's important to know the difference here. Pacific Way is a regional identity that grows out of the Pacific region, but it's a regional identity of how to handle conflicts peacefully, very important, peacefully, from Pacific Islanders' particular social experiences and tradition. And so this is sort of a way of life, it's an ideology, it's a philosophy. The book talks about it specifically in the Pacific, and specifically in Fiji, island nation. Now there's a less fun and a less pleasant Pacific influence is the Pacific solution, Australia and New Zealand's controversial approach to the excess number of undocumented immigrants, largely coming from wartime, refugees, coming from some of the different wars in Asia and Southwest Asia or the Middle East, as you'd probably know. And so these ideas in these camps and some of these holding areas, largely controversial for developed countries such as Australia and New Zealand. But there's a global influence too, not just the Pacific influence, but also the global colonization of the region. So this region colonized, Australia and New Zealand colonized by the British and the English, so the British Empire and the English. The United States and France have been involved in the region. French Polynesia and New Caledonia. So the French have had their, continue to actually have administrative control today. French Polynesia and New Caledonia as well. And the United States continues to have administrative control in the region. The Mariana Islands, Guam, American Samoa, and others. And so, again, this administrative control until today, with the United States and France still having an influence, surely a recent influence with the English not too many years ago through colonization. So you have the idea of the English, the French, and the United States having had control or still having control of some of the region, and this idea, this very deep connection with the West and with specifically Europe is still very fresh and raw within the people of the Oceania region. So the influence of war and refugees has brought a more diverse group of people inhabiting the island, specifically Australia and New Zealand. But after times of war, there's refugees, as we've come to know, and these refugees obviously are fleeing, need a place to be, and so there's been an influx of different kinds of ethnic and cultural groups that have now inhabited largely Australia that are not typical of the English Europeans that have dominated the island thus far. So now we have a large or a growing population from Asia and the Middle East. And we say Middle East is Southwest Asia, but then also East Asia as well. And so that's had an impact on the cultural diversity. We now know that 30% of Australians are foreign born. I'll probably mention that again later. So urbanization. Approximately 70% of the overall population of Oceania as a region live in urban areas. Largely those urban areas then would be more densely populated than some of these rural or largely even uninhabited islands. But it's not too surprising to see that nearly 90% of Australians and New Zealanders live in urban areas, the highest in the world outside of Europe. So the highest rate of urbanization outside of Europe comes in Australia and New Zealand, largely because we mentioned that string of cities, Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, just in the southeast section, southeast corridor of Australia. A lot of the population living and residing there. New Zealanders have a few key cities like Wellington and Auckland as well. And so as a result of urbanization, not so much in Australia and New Zealand where their multiculturalism has been more widespread for a longer period of time, but in these smaller island nations that we really don't talk too much about in this chapter, when they're moving from smaller islands seeking life, like we have talked about before, and even some of our most recent examples when we talk about rural to urban migration in, for instance, the Philippines, when people are leaving rural areas for Manila for work and a different kind of life. You see that from the islands as well. People moving from smaller islands to these islands where the key capital cities are. And when they do that, they're largely leaving behind their culture, and they're assimilating within the new culture that's there. And this idea of multiculturalism, the old and the new types of culture, customs and practices, ideologies, then takes. And there's this much more integration then taking place among the people, and largely, again, just due to urbanization. So population density varies by island, but largely remains low across the entire region. So largely, this is not a densely populated region. However, again, some islands can be obviously more densely populated than others. So there's only approximately 40 million people in the entire region. That's only 2 million people, give or take, larger than the state of California. California, about 38 million people, and Australia, we know, was 24 million people. And so Oceania as an entire region, 40 million people. So you can see Australia makes up a large percentage of that total population of the region. So the approximate area, geographic size of Australia is comparable to the contiguous or lower 48 states in the United States. We've already talked about that, so we don't need to mention any more of that. But again, it helps probably position population density for you, which is why it was included here. How we spread out, how we spread out 40 million people in the entire region, largely on small islands and otherwise, or in the case of Australia where there's 24 million people, how do we move 24 million people across the entire size of the United States? So it's much, it's very different in terms of population density. So socio-cultural issues, if you've been paying attention, this is always our last type when we talk about part 2. Socio-cultural issues. Social repositioning of indigenous peoples. So we have the Aboriginal people of Australia, those that were indigenous to the island, to the continent of Australia, and then we have the Maori people, indigenous. They come from a Polynesian group, but indigenous to New Zealand. And what we've seen over the last few decades are more and more people identifying themselves as Aboriginal or Maori peoples, largely because the negative perceptions surrounding these types of indigenous peoples have been shed as society continues to progress, and we recognize that these indigenous peoples there was negative attitudes towards these indigenous peoples, largely because they were of course different, and they were usually associated with poorer socioeconomic classes, but largely because they were oppressed because of colonization. And so when people recognize that this issue does come down to oppression over systematic oppression over decades, with moving peoples around against their will, taking land from them, continually putting them into smaller and lower socioeconomic classes. That once people realized that this was systematic and really not their fault, not the original, the indigenous people's faults, sort of a cozier perception has come along with them. One that's a little bit more apt and one that we should more embrace, that there is obviously something quite nice for these people to be able to claim their ethnic and their indigenous roots coming from the islands. So more and more people identifying themselves as Aboriginal peoples or indigenous peoples. So under sociocultural issues, we talked about uniting the entire region. Just like Indonesia, it's quite difficult to unite small, fragmented, low population density islands throughout a very large geographic area. This region, while not a lot of people, very large geographic area, not in land mass, but again, geographic area, these islands spread quite out. So moving around from island to island, now done via island hopping or small little jumper planes that go to and from the different islands. where they can go to larger islands and then hop on large jets and go to Australia, New Zealand, or Asia, or Hawaii, or the west coast of the United States. And they're referring to these as the canoes of the modern age. It's how, obviously, if you watch Moana or something, that you saw that it's how Polynesians and other peoples in this region got by for so many years before modern technology. And lastly, you can see here the New Zealand team, the All Blacks here performing haka. It is that traditional performance, if you will, that's done before their football games, their rugby football games, football being soccer. Sometimes it's just done not only related to sports, but it's a cultural thing as well, but done with their sporting events, and it's a cultural practice, haka, by the Maori people, the indigenous people of New Zealand, being performed there by the All Blacks, New Zealand's sports team. So sports is a unifying factor as well in the region. So that wraps us up with Oceania Part II. And if you've read the book, which who knows, let's just say we did, then you'll know that there's no sub-region section for the Oceania region, largely because we have Australia, we have New Zealand, and we have a lot of small little island nations. And nothing wrong with being small little island nations, and we certainly are not going to just graze over them, or cast them as insignificant just because they are small and don't have some large buying power or whatnot. But again, the book doesn't really give us sub-regions. So as a matter of fact, this is the end. This concludes World Geography Online here at FSU. So the final lecture, and at this point, just finish up looking over your materials, take that final exam, and wrap it up. And it's been a pleasure, and keep learning about the world.